psychological theories. We're going to begin with psychoanalytic theory. So psychological theories are trying to search for causes of crime within the individual, okay, generally within the mind of the individual. Some of these deal with classic Freudian psychoanalytic explanations. This is focusing on things that are abnormal or disturbances in someone's emotional development, with the idea that this begins in early childhood. So you guys might remember from criminology that Freud talks about three parts of the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the unconscious seat of irrational, antisocial, and instinctual impulses. This is sometimes referred to as like the I want part of the personality. This has to be controlled and shaped for social adaptation to life and society. This is done through the ego and the superego. So the superego is your conscience. It's the moralizing part of the mind. And then the ego is the rational, conscious part of the mind. And the ego is striking that balance between the superego, which is telling you how to properly behave, and those unconscious desires of the I want, id part. Psychological theories also talk about how people go through developmental stages and that they're rooted in sexuality. And Freud in particular talks about these 5 stages here. And they're based on, we sort of develop through them throughout as we age. So as an infant, you're in the oral stage, up to age 3 in the anal stage, up to age 5, the phallic stage, and up to puberty, the latency stage. And then as we develop as an adult, this is the mature genital stage. The id is uncontrolled until we develop our ego, and the ego gains control over instincts around age 3. Think about little kids. If you've ever seen a toddler in a store, they want something, they want it now, they don't understand why they can't have it now. Small children aren't really good at delaying gratification or waiting. Freud argues that at the beginning of the phallic stage, the child wants to possess the opposite sex parent and perceives the same-sex parent as a rival for the opposite sex parent's affection. These feelings become repressed, and you might develop an Oedipus or an Electra complex. Most of you guys have probably heard of an Oedipus complex, which is the unconscious love for the mother and hatred for the father. The Electra complex is the exact opposite. The superego, our conscience, the moral part of our personality, evolves by identifying with the same-sex parent and internalizing parental control. The child then gives up the desire to possess the opposite sex parent. So what happens if someone does not develop normally? Abnormal development during these stages can lead to someone being fixated at a particular stage of development, and this can lead to antisocial behavior. By adolescence, child struggles with the unconscious guilt and the pathology of this arrested development, right? So their development has stopped. So the basic premise in psychoanalytical theory is that the behavior itself is unimportant. It's basically a symptom of psychic conflict between the id, the ego, and the superego. And it arises when we haven't matured properly, when we haven't mastered control of our instincts. This could be from a poor early relationship with your mother or your father, becoming fixated at a stage of emotional development, or repressed sexuality or guilt, with the most critical fixation occurring at that Oedipus Electra stage. So the true cause of delinquency here is repressed guilt and conflict. Other neo-Freudian explanations, so neo means new Freudian explanations, emphasize underdevelopment or disturbed development of the superego, right? So that conscious part of you has conscience, not conscious like awake, conscious like moral, has either not developed fully or has been disrupted due to either the absence of parents or the presence of cruel and unloving parents. Crimes then become an expression of unresolved guilt, and criminals are unconsciously seeking to be caught and punished in order to deal with that repressed guilt. Psychoanalytic explanations rely heavily on irrational and unconscious motivations. All crime then becomes an expression or a symptom of mental illness, emotional disorders, or psychic disturbances, with early childhood events being seen as critical. The current environment is irrelevant, or it's really only important as a trigger to this underlying unconscious motivation. So think about a theory like this. If we wanted to test this theory to prove that it is empirically valid, right, that we have studied it scientifically, it's very difficult. And the language used is strongly deterministic. If you think about the language here, they're basically saying, like, if this happens, this will happen. So obviously this is theory that is very difficult to prove. Flora Schreiber interviewed this guy, Joseph Callender, who was a shoemaker who committed a series of burglaries, robberies, and murders with his son. Schreiber, after interviewing Callender, reached some firm conclusions and diagnosed Callender with psychosis caused by the psychological and physical abuse of him as a child by his adoptive parents. When Joseph was 4, they told him his hernia operation was to remove a demon from his penis. So they also made comments to him that were basically psychologically castrating. And Schreiber says this is the primary cause of his psychosis, which drives him to kill. Again, how would you prove this? Right? This would be really difficult to prove. How do you measure this? When we think about something causing crime, as you guys will think about research methods, we're thinking about how do we show one thing causes another. It'd be pretty difficult here to show that this hernia operation, as weird as his parents were, is what led him to kill. So when we look at psychological theories, we have a lot of psychiatric studies here, and they're relying pretty heavily on clinical and case studies. So someone might have access to a particular population of mental health patients, or some individual case studies. And so we should see widely varying results. Case studies can be very useful in terms of helping us really understand what a situation is like. So if we were to go back and read a little bit more about Callender, or if you guys remember when you were writing your court capstone papers and you were really delving into a particular offender, you learn a lot about that offender and what motivates that offender. But it doesn't really tell us about all offenders or even all similar offenders. These studies tend to concentrate on individual cases or small samples of very serious offenders. They're often not compared with samples of other offenders or the general population. So it's pretty hard, basically. How would we test psychoanalytic theory directly? We're talking about people's motivations. That's deeply hidden in the unconscious. And as Freud and other psychoanalytic theorists are saying here, that it really is an unconscious motivation. So how do I tap into what my unconscious motivations are? And having worked with offenders myself in the past, even when I would talk to offenders where there seemed to be some pretty clear causes of their delinquency, they would often say those things weren't causes. So I think even if you were to talk to offenders, you might not get an accurate read on motivations. It also tends to be tautological. So remember, tautological means we've got some circular reasoning here and untestable. Right? So that makes these not very useful theories because we can't, first of all, they're using pieces of their theory to measure whether or not their theory works. They're tautological, they're sort of circular, and it's very difficult for us to test. So the psychiatric deviation assumed to be the cause is determined as a result of the behavior. Right? So it shouldn't be that the behavior causes the behavior, if that makes sense. Let's think about personality theory. Personality theory says the problem is abnormal, inadequate, or criminal personality types or traits. So this can be traits like impulsiveness, aggressiveness, sensation-seeking, rebelliousness, hostility. And this theory would argue that criminals and law-abiding folks have different personality types. Right? So we've got law-abiding folks would be more conformist versus aberrant personalities. Now, if we think about this in terms of antisocial personality disorder, psychopath, sociopath, we've got self-centered people who have not been properly socialized into pro-social attitudes and values. They don't really have a sense of right or wrong. They don't feel any guilt. They can't empathize with others. can do is there are several measurements or tools or assessments that psychologists use to assess people's personality traits. One of the more common ones is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And this is the most commonly used. And it's got a series of scales that measures abnormal personality traits. Depression, hysteria, paranoia, psychopathology, introversion, extroversion, and compulsiveness. There's also a California Psychological Inventory. This looks at variations in things like dominance, tolerance, sociability. The MMPI is designed to detect deviant personality patterns in mentally ill adults. Using it to predict delinquency is based on the assumption that delinquency is a symptom of mental illness. Okay? So people who are mentally ill, one of the symptoms of that would be delinquent behavior. So some research has shown that institutionalized delinquents, so delinquents that have been psychiatrically institutionalized or incarcerated, score higher on the scales of asocial, amoral, and psychopathic behavior. Now, in some ways, that makes sense, right? Because how would one end up institutionalized? Attempts, though, of predicting future delinquency are not very successful. So if we were to use this test and to conduct personality tests, if we were to use this assessment with everyone in our class, we wouldn't be able to predict who might engage in future criminal behavior. The strongest predictive scale, the F scale, doesn't measure any traits at all. It records inconsistent or careless responses and poor reading ability in completing the questionnaire. Other research findings that look at causative effects of personality traits are inconsistent. What we hope to see with research is that people will conduct a study. If the study shows that whatever the researcher has hypothesized, certain personality traits lead to delinquency, then what we would hope is as we replicate that study, we would find consistent results. Early reviews showed only a minority of these studies found significant differences. Some somewhat later reviews found a majority of the more carefully conducted studies found significant differences. And later studies found correlations between personality traits and self-reported measures of delinquency. Now, the most recent studies find scores on at least some personality inventories are consistently correlated with criminal behavior, but it's a weak relationship. So if you think back to research methods and you think back to statistics, right, we're looking for a couple of things. We're looking for, first, is the relationship, what we've hypothesized, statistically significant? So it's not random, it's not due to chance. There's a real relationship there. But then another thing we would look at is how strong that relationship is. So something might be very statistically significant, but have a very small impact on something. So what we're saying here is then that these more recent studies do find correlation, but it's pretty weak, right? So there's not a strong relationship there. Some of the measures are tautological. So the MMPI as a personality trait asks about trouble with the law. So then if we're using the MMPI to predict criminal behavior, we're saying trouble with the law predicts criminal behavior. Well, of course it does. That's one of the things the scale is supposed to explain. When conduct disorder is proposed as a cause, it's problematic because, again, the scale asks about law violations. So as I said, getting into trouble with the law is caused by getting into trouble with the law. So there is some empirical support, but there aren't strong findings that this is a major cause of delinquency. What about the psychopathic personality? So we've talked about this before. We talked about antisocial personality disorder. People tend to be self-centered, aggressive, they're maladjusted, they might be sensation seekers, and they tend to not feel guilt, and they're generally unable to form meaningful emotional attachments to others. So if you don't feel guilt, if you don't feel any strong attachment to other people, think about how that could free up any restraints on your behavior. So Hare is this guy who is really, I guess, sort of probably the most famous researcher who's worked with, ASPD, right? So he has written the psychopathy checklist, okay? And there's a juvenile version and an adult version, although we generally sort of shy away from diagnosing juveniles or minors as psychopaths. research on this. He's actually written a couple of books that, if this is something that interests you, I could recommend to you. They're not very textbooky. They're short, easy reads. And so what he has done is he has put together traits that they look for, and this is how they would determine, generally speaking, whether or not someone is a psychopath. So generally we're looking at people who are self-centered social predators who manipulate others for their own purpose. Some people argue, is it psychopath, is it sociopath? But he prefers the term psychopath. It reflects the contributions of psychology, biology, and genetic factors as opposed to social factors. So biological factors work against normal socialization and the formation of the conscience. Social factors like poor parenting and parental abuse affect the development of psychopathy. It's important to remember not all psychopaths are criminals. There are many psychopaths that you would not know are psychopaths that are very successful people. And not all criminals are psychopaths. However, psychopaths are well represented in prison. They're probably about 20% of inmates and responsible for more than half of all serious crimes. Also, their recidivism rate is about 3 times higher. But determining if someone is a psychopath is complex. It should only be done by a trained professional. One can have some of these symptoms or traits and not be a psychopath. Checklist has 2 sets of key symptoms. One is depicting feelings in relationships. So we're looking for people who are glib, superficial, deceitful, lacking remorse, guilt, or empathy, and have shallow emotions. And then we're also looking at social deviance, impulsive behavior, need for stimulation, early behavioral problems. The traditional view of psychopathy is that it is a distinct personality type that differs from law-abiding people. Hare says it's a constellation of extreme levels of continuously distributed personality traits. And there is some empirical support for that. There are a number of real-world criterion that are associated with the checklist. There are an increased risk for misconduct while institutionalized, community violence, and criminal recidivism. There are, however, some tautological problems here. So some diagnostic terms are measures of prior deviant behavior. So then we're saying deviant behavior predicts deviant behavior. Psychopathy is measured by early behavioral problems, pathological lying, promiscuous behavior, commission of deviant behavior, criminal versatility, and revocation of probation or parole. So those are all things that psychopathy should be used. Psychopathy should explain those behaviors, those criminal behaviors, and we're using them as ways, as definitions of psychopathy. All right, so we want to be very careful here that when we're defining something, that we're not tautological in our definition. So psychological counseling is used in delinquency prevention and treatment. It's used widespread, especially with juvenile offenders. Policy implications then for psychological theories are pretty direct and obvious, right? If something is wrong with you developmentally or mentally, or mental illness is the cause, then we need to treat that mental illness. Okay? So offenders should be treated as though they are ill. They're not being responsible for their behavior in a rational sense, therefore punishment will not be effective. You have to treat the underlying emotional disturbance. If we were to treat just the crime, we're just treating the symptoms. So we have to uncover those repressed motivations and then deal with them in a rational, healthy way. Usually through intense, in-depth, individual therapy. These have been adopted, as I said, on a wide scale. Every juvenile institution I've ever worked in provides therapy. Usually kids have once a week one-on-one therapy with with a therapist or a social worker. They usually had family therapy once a month or every other week. And then they had group therapy 3 or 4 times a week. Hare is pessimistic about the use of therapy for psychopaths and argues that it may actually make them worse. Many of these programs, though, are well thought out, intensive, and despite that, still ineffective. Early childhood intervention may not work either. So Hare is more focused on how can we avoid being victimized by someone who's a psychopath. You have to protect yourself, don't blame yourself, have a plan for damage control, and obtain professional support. Let's talk a little bit about some programs. based on the theory that some psychological issue is at play in offending. So Wayne County, which is in Detroit, had a clinic in the 20s and 40s, and it was private clinic staffed with psychologists and psychiatrists who accepted cases referred by the juvenile court. Now, they accepted the people who were most amenable to treatment, those people who would most likely benefit. Recidivism was not reduced, and the sessions did not have the intended effect. Cambridge Somerville Youth Study in New Jersey. It's the first large-scale, thoroughly evaluated program. It's from 1937 to 1945, where they worked with 650 adolescent boys. Half were nominated with no delinquent tendencies, and half were nominated by teachers, police, etc. as delinquency prone. So this gives them the opportunity then to compare people who appear to be at risk versus people who appear to not be at risk. They collected some additional information about home and school, did medical exams, personality tests, and then they used an experimental research design. So they randomly assigned people to either a treatment group, right, where they were going to get what they believed the intervention to be, or a control group where nothing different is done. So the treatment group gets intensive individual counseling, which helps improve their school performance. They worked on family issues, and this paid direct attention only to their individual problems. But there were few differences between the group that received treatment and the group that received no treatment. The treatment group was more likely to have more than one contact with the police, committed slightly more offenses, were more likely to appear in juvenile court. They had a slightly higher proportion in the control group, were in the most serious offense category. They followed up with these individuals in the 50s and found there were no difference in crimes committed as adults. Those in the treatment group did have great memories of their relationships with the counselors, but those who received counseling were actually more likely to be repeat offenders, abuse alcohol, and develop mental illness as adults. Now, there's some problems with this study, though, as there are with all studies. The study got interrupted by World War II. This disrupted both the counselors and the youth, as some of them were drafted. Those assessed as average dropped out in greater numbers, and so there were many people here who did not spend full treatment period in the program. They did some projects designed to replicate that Cambridge Somerville study, and one is the New York Youth Consultation Service Project from 1955 to 1960. This also was not effective. This dealt with 400 girls at a vocational high school who were predominantly minority and lower class. Girls who were at risk were identified in the 10th grade and randomly assigned to counseling. They followed up with them at the end of the year and again when they graduated. The treatment group was slightly less likely to be suspended or expelled, but there were no difference in grades, honors, truancy, school attendance, personality test scores, sociometric patterns, or self-concept, and no differences in contacts with the police. The New York Youth Board and the Maximum Benefits Project in D.C., right around the mid-50s, dealt with adjudicated males, and they were randomly assigned to a state institution, which was the control group for counseling. Those in the state institution, right, this is a group that's not receiving the intervention, actually did slightly better, and there was very little difference in their recidivism rates. The PICO project was treatment within state institutions in California, mid to late 50s, and people were either diagnosed as amenable or non-amenable to change. They were randomly assigned to groups, and treatment lasted 2 years, and then they were followed up for 3 years after that. Again, little difference, and the amenable boys who did receive treatment did somewhat better. The Community Treatment Project, California's I-Level program, ran in the 60s, and this looked at used individual counseling and intensive parole supervision. So you guys might remember intensive probation, similar idea, okay? They used the interpersonal maturity level theory of personality. This posits a sequence of personality integrations in normal childhood development, which occurs in 7 stages. And they were assigned treatment based on where they fell when they were tested in those 7 stages of development. They were randomly assigned to caseloads, and supervisors used group homes, intensive supervision, counseling, education, detention, and community resources. And they tailored these to the needs of the individual juveniles. The control group were kids who were just sentenced straight off to state institutions. They had more than 400 participants, the overwhelming majority of them were male. Research shows that the program did not achieve its goal, and that the treatment group was less likely to have their parole revoked, but they committed 3 times as many new offenses as the control group. Also, their misbehavior was more visible than the control group. You might recall when you learned about intensive supervision probation that more contact with your probation or parole officer means your bad behavior is going to be more likely to be noticed. Treatment counselors were invested in the program, more reluctant to send their juveniles back. Post-discharge from the program, there were no differences in rearrest rates for the 2 groups.